Can you hear me? Are you in the first year of European studies? Where's the rest? Okay, thank you for coming. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Misha Kemper. You probably saw me in Constructing Europe in the fall. I will be your teacher for the 4 lectures that are still on the agenda for this course. And I hope to offer you some coherent insight into things like conflicts, what is the European Union doing about them, how do we achieve positions, and what kind of threats are still ahead. I'm an historian, an Arabist, Islamic studies person working on Muslims in Eastern Europe, but I've been teaching on Russian Soviet policies since the early 2000s, and this course as well. So my specialty is not in political relations, not in IR, but in narratives and in humanities. And this is how I integrate knowledge on what we have to say about current events into our humanities curriculum of how to make sense of things. Where are we and how did we get here? You already see the 2 pictures. One is the past and one is the present. The past is something I will talk about today and also tomorrow, which is Yugoslavia, the downfall of Yugoslavia, the explosion, if you wish, the wars that erupted, and the positions that the European Union and the United States took in that respect. This is my part of introducing Yugoslavia and former Yugoslavia to you, the history of Southeastern Europe. But we'll be looking at that through the prism of international law. We look at the genealogies of these conflicts, that is of how they developed since the 1990s, in our neighborhood and thereby preoccupied the European Union or European community at that time. We'll be looking at borders and how borders shift, how borders get recognized or ignored. And we will be continuing this neighborhood policies and enlargement focus that you already had with the last lectures. We look at reactions to events that take place in our neighborhood. In the first part of our classes, this will be Yugoslavia, first Croatia and Bosnia, and then Kosovo tomorrow. And we look at the politicization of the European Union. What started as a legal and economic project became something like a security project as well. This is where we are, right in the middle of it. The attacks on Iran have preoccupied us now for the 10th day in a row. What this is pretty obvious from what we get from the news. We have a coordinated attack by Israel and the United States on Iran. What they are saying is that they want to do away with the nuclear program that Iran has and thereby safeguard the security in particular of Israel, but also of the rest of the Middle East and also of the United States of America. At least this is an argument that was brought forward at the beginning of this war. As you have noticed, Donald Trump is very outspoken about this war. He says he wants unconditional surrender of Iran. From the perspective of international law, war is justified if there are either a defense situation, which means a country is being attacked, then you can use violence to defend yourself. The other event in which a country is justified to use violence is if there is a United Nations regulation on it. That is, if the United Nations, the Security Council, or the General Assembly, which is all states together, have voted on the situation and have decided that the use of weapons is justifiable. In both of these conditions do not apply here. There is no evidence, and any international law expert would tell you, there is no evidence that Iran has threatened the United States or Israel with a really existing nuclear bomb. And there is no United Nations Council order to use violence against Iran. With other words, international experts will tell you that this war is not justified according to international law. What happened is, you see the map, this is a map from the beginning of the war. Lots of places in Iran are being bombed. The leader, the spiritual leader, so to say, Ayatollah Khamenei has been killed in one of these early assassination bombings, I would call it. But there are also lots of explosions in the states around Iran, and that has to do with US military bases there. The US have reinforced their military presence in the area, including by aircraft carriers that carry many missiles that are being sent to Iran. The official death casualty number coming from Iran is very moderate. They talk about 2,000 people so far. But as we are talking about thousands of missile strikes and bombs, this number is probably excluding the casualties in the Iranian army and in the Revolutionary Guard, which means the number of casualties might be much higher. The war has also been justified by the repression of the Iranian regime against its own population. And that is something that we saw in January. In January, you saw an uprising, a protest movement in Iran first against the dire economic situation of the country, but then more and more against the regime. The regime has been in power since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution that did away with the monarchy of Iran, with the Shah, which was a staunch American ally in the region. And then this Islamic State has created a kind of hybrid democracy where on the one hand you have a parliament with elected delegates and you have a president who is elected by the population, but you still have on top this supreme leader who is manipulating the regime and taking care of the elimination of political opponents when it comes to elections. With other words, formally it's a republic, but in reality it is a dictatorship by this person who has now been killed. And the last news that we got over the weekend is that his son, Mujtaba Khamenei, has been brought into position of the supreme leader. With other words, there is a continuity now in the supreme leadership, and Iran is far from giving up. Which means the war is going on and will probably carry on for much longer. The Iranian military is big. We hear of other conflicts that are coming up, like the Americans trying to move Iraqi troops, that is Iraq, you see that on the map, of the Kurdish units in the north of Iraq into Iran, which of course would make this conflict even bigger, and also including Iraq. Iraq has a very unstable kind of balance between the Kurds and the Shi'is in the south, which means another vulnerable state where, as you know, the Americans have invaded in 2003 and have largely withdrawn without being able to stabilize the regime to a satisfactory level. Okay, this is where we are, and this is also where we ask ourselves, what do we have to do with it? On the one hand, there is a very clear thing that we have to do with it, namely, we are suffering from it. The Iranians are blocking the Strait of Hormuz, which is this strait that is basically the kind of the pathway for most of the oil tankers and gas tankers that would bring liquid gas and oil from Iraq, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, but also Iran, through the Indian Ocean and then through the Red Sea to Europe. Not only to Europe, but also to China and India. So much of the world really has been accustomed to getting the oil and LNG from the area. LNG, you might remember, is very important for the European Union for the green transition policy. That is for replacing coal and oil and other gas coming from Russia by means from other countries. So we will be seeing gas prices going up, and on the other hand, we don't have much of a say in this matter. What does Europe have to respond? On the one hand, you have the president of the Spanish government, Pedro Sánchez, who from the very beginning said, we say no to the war. We don't allow the Americans to use the bases, the military bases that they have in Spain, in this war on Iran. This is a very strong position, as it puts Spain in a very vulnerable situation. As you might have noticed over the past year, Trump usually reacts by imposing tariffs on countries that do not behave like he wants them to behave. Imposing tariffs, particularly on Spain, will be very difficult because Spain is in the European Union. So tariffs targeting only one country would also target the rest of the European Union. And the other European Union leaders are either very silent or very hesitating to say anything. The new Dutch government has said, we have some understanding for the Americans and the Israelis to attack Iran, and that has to do with the gross human rights violations of the Iranian regime. The German Chancellor Merz went to Trump and was the first to talk to Trump, and he didn't stop Trump when he was really abusing the Spanish government for their rejection of this war, but tried to keep on being on good terms with Trump to at least have a say in the matter. This was the German position. The British position was somewhere in between. On the one hand, the British said, we don't allow the Americans to use British bases to launch offensive actions against Iran. But later on, it became clear that the British bases are well used, but are used only for defensive measures. What that would mean is to knock out anti-aircraft missile positions in Iran. Now, you can argue whether eliminating anti-aircraft defense systems in Iran is a defensive measure or an offensive measure. What you see from this diagram, from this spectrum of European opinions towards the ongoing war, is that there is no unified European position, but people respond spontaneously. The British, the UK, has also been hit by Iran, so there were Iranian drones exploding on an UK basis in Cyprus, which means there is also the question of what do we have to do in order to defend the United Kingdom. At this point, Dutch Navy vessels are together with French Navy vessels, including an aircraft carrier, on their way to the area, to the Eastern Mediterranean, with, as we understand, the idea that they would be supporting the free passage through the Red Sea, but maybe also through the Strait of Hormuz. So the Europeans are involved already, whether they say they refrain from being involved or not, because we have to defend our territories, including Cyprus and including the UK military positions there. Turkey as well has been targeted by a missile from Iran. Obviously, this missile has been shot down, which leads us to the question, what will happen if more of these missiles coming from Iran end up on NATO territory? The first response from the US, but also from Turkey and other nations of the European Union, was that NATO is not yet asked to deliberate whether they want to use Article 5. Article 5 is the basis, the fundament of NATO solidarity, namely the idea that if one country is being attacked, all other countries are being convoked, are being called upon to help that country, including by military defense. Okay? So this is the starter for a very grim story. My story will bring you back to the 1990s and to a war at our doorstep, namely in Yugoslavia. But you see that the same kind of issue of how do we make up our positions is still very important also in our times. And the same mechanisms seem to be at work, namely European disunity, and at the same time the leadership role of the United States that try to manage situations for us, whether they are in Europe or in the Middle East. There is another question. We will come to Russia's policies in the Middle East. They are very obvious. Russia has had a strong ally in Syria, which it lost in 2024 when the old regime of Bashar al-Assad fell and Syria became a state largely governed by Turkey. Russia has lost allies in other countries, including in Venezuela. Venezuela was a strong ally of the Russians. Another Russian ally is Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we see that Israel is bombing Hezbollah at this point. And Russia is keeping quiet. Russia is calling this war unjustified and a breach of international law, but Russia is not supporting its allies. It's not supporting Hezbollah, it's not supporting Iran, it hasn't really supported Bashar al-Assad when he fell in the fall of 24. So it's keeping a low profile, obviously, because Russia is very much busy with Ukraine still in the war that has been going on since 2022. Next week, we will also be looking at that war and at European decision-making concerning Russia's war in Ukraine. There are other voices that say a war in the Middle East is very much benefiting Russia's position. On the one hand, because it makes the oil price go through the ceiling, which will force the Europeans to return to buying Russian oil and gas, perhaps. Anyways, it will support Russia because it gets more money for its exports. If, for instance, China has to do without oil and gas from Iran because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked and Trump is banning Iran from exporting any oil and gas, then this might be Russia's chance to get more of its own export into these countries like India and China, but also Vietnam and Indonesia and other places. There is another benefit to Russia, namely the countries around Iran, including, of course, the United States and Israel, need a lot of air defense systems. And these air defense systems are the ones that Ukraine is urgently asking for, has been asking for since day one of the war that Russia has been waging on Ukraine. So the diversion of US air defense systems to the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, means that there is less material to provide to Ukraine, and Zelensky has already been very furious about that. But the most lasting effect of this war by Israel and the United States, without their allies, without NATO, without even one airplane from Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates until this point, this war is eroding international law. This war is clearly not caring about international law and is basically putting the old claims of the West that we have to protect Ukraine because Russia is violating international law by attacking Ukraine and violating its territory and its boundaries into the dustbin of history. The old arguments that countries, especially the powerful countries, should abide by international law and thereby take care of the smaller countries who have a right to sovereignty and to the national self-determination of their nations, these rights are being trampled upon if wars can just be started by a decision of the president without even asking Congress and without asking other NATO partners about this. Okay, so this might be very much in the interest of the Russian Federation. This whole thing comes not out of the blue. It is part of a longer history of Trump's policy. Trump already in 2018, when he was in power as president in his first term, drew out of an agreement that the Europeans largely designed with Iran, but also with the former president Barack Obama on board, that would not allow Iran to have military uses for nuclear force, but would allow Iran to have a civil nuclear program to develop nuclear energy, which is not banned by any regulation in the world. Any country in the world can use nuclear energy in a civil way. So that is one aspect to it, the Trump policy. The other is, what are we doing with Ukraine? You see some of these newspaper headings here. We are in the middle. They are from last year, but I left them because they're still the case. Russia is bombing Ukraine every day. We don't see them in the news as much because of the ongoing events in Iran. The end of the Pax Americana is in sight. Pax Americana meaning the peace that the Americans established in Europe, the idea that NATO and the US will give us a kind of nuclear umbrella that will protect us so that no war is possible at all, because any war, any kind of attack on a European country would mean that the Americans use nuclear weapons or at least support that country within the Article 5 provisions of NATO. We do not know whether this is true anymore because Trump has made a lot of statements that go into the directions of saying, if this case emerges, I will have to see whether I want to respond. Why would I draw America into a third world war? This is what he said to Zelensky. The US will benefit from a divided Europe. So before Trump won, the idea was that the US has an interest in a unified Europe because it's a common market. It's a solid ally in all affairs, including in the war in Iraq in 2003 and elsewhere, in Afghanistan and in other places in this world. And it's an international economic partner of the first rank. But obviously under Trump, the idea is that Europe can easily be divided, and these divisions should be fostered so that Trump is supporting some European leaders against others. Do we need to fear higher state debts? Obviously, this situation without the nuclear defense security promise, we are forced to take care of our own defense. We are no longer able to enjoy the peace dividend, as it was called, namely the idea that after the end of the Cold War, the West can relax and we can focus on the economy, on liberal international relations, on democracy, and on education. Now we are forced to invest into our armies, but how do we do that without taking new loans that would allow us to update our military capacities in the absence of American security? Europe must pull the European chart alone, says Caroline de Gruyter, who is an observer in the NRC newspaper. So obviously Ukraine falls on the shoulders of Europe and not the US anymore. The US may provide weapons to Europe, but only if the Europeans pay, and we will have to accumulate debts for that. Obviously, this leads to a huge potential of conflicts within the European Union. On the one hand, you have the rich countries and you have the poor countries in the European Union. You have those that pay into the European Union cash and those that benefit from the distribution of funds. And one of the benefactors of those who benefit is, of course, Hungary under Orban. Orban, as you know, Prime Minister, is facing elections next month, within a month or so, and his polls doesn't look very well. He has been blocking the next aid package for Ukraine and has been doing that consistently. Usually, the other European powers have been able to turn him over in the last minute in past situations where Orban also blocked European support for Ukraine, but at this point it doesn't seem so, simply because he's facing elections and he doesn't want to appear like a weak person towards his own electorate. In the last days, this led to a very unpleasant exchange between Zelensky, who said, if Orban continues to block European aid for Ukraine, then we will give his address to our special forces. Now, this is an unacceptable threat, of course, and Orban used that immediately in his own speech to the nation that he's having every week and says, we will not abandon our policy of not supporting Ukraine simply because of this personal threat. We will not support the money that is being given to Ukraine, and Ukraine is blocking our oil and gas. So Ukraine is blocking the passage of oil and gas going traditionally through Ukraine to Hungary, and Hungary has been very hungry for this oil and gas, just like Slovakia. At the same time, the European Union has made arrangements for Slovakia and Hungary to obtain oil and gas from the West. That is not directly from Russia, but for Orban, this is a matter of principle. He wants good relations with Russia and thereby also enforces on Ukraine that they open the gas pipeline. For Ukraine, the gas pipeline thing is also a matter of principle because it means the selling of gas by Russia to European countries is putting more budgets into Russia's military and thereby into the war that it's waging on Ukraine. All right, these are just two instances of divisions of Europe in current conflict situations, and we will discuss these all through this and the next week. This third part is called shifting borders, and borders pertains to many different things. On the one hand, borders are very palpable things like frontiers that guard states, that states set up where you have negotiations and agreements about how far a territory goes. So borders pertain to territories, and they pertain to sovereignty. The sovereignty of a state within its territory that cannot be violated, that cannot be ignored by other states. But borders also change. We're talking about the one change in Yugoslavia where borders changed, where borders disappeared, and the whole design of Yugoslavia seemed to go down. And when borders change, this is usually a recipe for war and violence and mass killings. Because the human mind is accustomed to the idea that territory belongs to certain nations, to ethnic groups who speak one language, who believe in this God, and who have a history that goes back into times immemorial of defending this territory. This is one thing that I want to talk to you about. But borders are also in our mind. For instance, the use of the nuclear force is a border, is a kind of hesitation, is a kind of limit that we set ourselves. So far, this limit has been working since 1945, when the Americans dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But since the war in Ukraine, there have been many speculations about where's the point that nuclear weapons will be used. Not for the complete annihilation of the enemy, perhaps, but for strategic purposes, for destroying one city, for destroying one garrison. And we are moving closer and closer to the question, when is it allowed to use a nuclear weapon? And not a strategic weapon to destroy the whole of Moscow or the whole of New York, but simply to destroy a tank division or to make a point that nuclear weapons can be used. So borders are physical, but they're also mental, they're also political in our heads. And they all lead to the question, will we go to war? There is another conflict that we should have in mind, and that is in the Western Balkans. So I will be talking about Yugoslavia, which is reaching back into the 1990s, 80s, and 90s. But the conflicts are still there, especially for one of the constructs that came out of the end of the war of Yugoslavia, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you have one part, namely the Serbian part, that under Milorad Dodik, who is now no longer the president, but who is still pulling the strings, threatens with a withdrawal from the agreement on Bosnia-Herzegovina, namely to stay together with the Croat and with the Muslim parts, and thereby is challenging the result of the Yugoslav wars, namely the Dayton agreements that created a very vulnerable but still existing entity of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Again, playing with fire is this, because it means if one side withdraws, the whole thing collapses, and other agreements of the 1990s, of the late 1990s, might collapse as well. Shifting borders is linked to nationalisms, which means to these ideas of ethnic belonging, of that it's taken for granted that nations exist as clear-cut entities with a common ancestry and a claim on the ground in which they have been living since thousands of years. It has to do with democratic and authoritarian regimes, the idea that democracy can expand, but obviously what we are seeing over the past years also that democracy can withdraw, that democracy can be giving way to authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes, in particular in Russia, but also in parts of the European Union. These changes of political systems create security threats, and they challenge the established security order in Europe that I just outlined with the help of talking about NATO. There is, for today, the problem of recognizing new boundaries, new borders, new frontiers that come up. And then if a state comes up, it wants to be recognized. It wants security. Recognition of boundaries comes with a promise that you don't challenge these boundaries, that the international players recognize your right to have these boundaries. The boundaries of a state, however, might be challenged from within, from minorities living in these states that have been repressed by the state majority nation. In that case, you get another right that is applied, namely the right of national self-determination of a minority that has been living in a majority state where the majority has been suppressing this minority. And there are cases of that in Yugoslavia as well. And then there is the right to self-defense, including of the United States, Israel, and Iran in a situation where we are now, but also, of course, of Ukraine. So we talk about conflicts and wars since the 1990s, and our focus is on Southeastern Europe with Bosnia and Serbia and with Ukraine and Russia. And we'll be focusing on what is the position of the European community and then European Union on that point. Today, what to do with post-Yugoslavia. Tomorrow, I continue what I'm talking about today, namely by looking at how the Bosnian War ended, and then focusing on the Kosovo War of 1999. Next week, we will be looking at Russia's war in Ukraine, and then in the final lecture of this course, I hope to focus on China, not in military perspective, but in the perspective of security in economic terms. Namely, what does it mean if China is buying huge assets in Southeastern Europe and is having special agreements with authoritarian leaders of the European Union? This also leads us to future European Union accession questions, namely, will we further expand, including by, for instance, embracing Ukraine, Moldova, and other countries as members of the European Union, including Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia, maybe? Or are there other scenarios for doing that? Finally, another item that I want to bring to your attention, and I do not yet know when, is Greenland. Because the issue that we had about who owns Greenland last December, it's not far away, we just forgot about it because Trump kept silent since then, is one that is to the point of the question of borders and possessions. The first hour, I want to talk about Yugoslavia. My alarm clock will go in 10 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes of break, and I will use this time to give you a brief introduction of Yugoslavia. There were 3 Yugoslavias, and the one that interests me here is the second one, which is the socialist Yugoslavia. So we didn't talk yet about socialist countries in Europe. Well, the way of creating socialism as an ideological system. I think I talked about Russia, but not about Yugoslavia in the first course that you had. And then the third one, the third Yugoslavia, that was the rump, the rest of it, after Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia left. This is the situation that we are in. We're talking about the collapse of one regime, namely socialism, and the emergence of another one, namely nationalism and the redrawing of boundaries. Usual conventional wisdom has it that Yugoslavia was held together by this gentleman. Tito, Josip Broz, was a leader in the partisan war of the Second World War against the Nazis, against Germany, but also against the Italians, against the Croat fascist forces, and he liberated Yugoslavia. He and his socialist forces, supported by Stalin, by the USSR, created the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia by the end of the Second World War. And this state became internationally recognized, was first a staunch ally of the Soviet Union, but then Tito broke with Stalin and he kept his own kind of vision of what socialism would be and tried to milk 2 cows, namely to be able to get support from the West, but also from the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia became a socialist state that was not just a copy of the USSR, but was much more open to Western investment, but also to Western tourists, and that still kept the entities of the Croats, the Slovenes, the Serbs, the Bosnians, and the Macedonians and Montenegrins, and many others together. Conventional wisdom has it that Tito ruled with an iron fist, and that Yugoslavia was held together by his strong dictatorship. My argument will be that this is not the case, because he delegated powers. Tito, especially in the last decade of his life, was no longer the firm ruler, but just the arbiter in a game between the national republics. Now, what are national republics? Yugoslavia has national groups, and here you see the major ones. These are just majorities. In red, you have the Serbians, which make 8 million or so by the end of the 1970s. Croats are the yellows, and in between you have these territories that are ethnically not homogeneous, where you have especially the green spots, which would be territories inhabited by a Muslim majority. Again, this map here is highly simplifying, because it only shows majorities. So also in the green areas, you have Croat and Orthodox, that is Serbian minorities, and the other way around. In Serbia, you also have Muslim minorities. This is a census from 1981, and you see the numbers are clear. The Serbs are in the majority, but they're also split all over the place. You see the Republican names, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Slovenia. And you see that in particular in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but also in Croatia, the ethnic map doesn't match the boundaries. And if the ethnic map doesn't match the boundaries, the state boundaries within Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia is a federation of these republics, then this is a problem, because it can mean that you get separatism in states that have a clear majority, but a minority that is living in a compact fashion on the territory. You see that here, for instance, in Croatia, which is one of the areas that I will be focusing about. The major nations that I just mentioned, so Slovenes in the north, Croats, Serbs, but also Bosnian Muslims, are marked by their religions. So in conventional wisdom, you have it that the Serbs would all be Orthodox, the Croats would all be Catholics, and Muslims would be Muslims. At the same time, when we talk about these entities, we are not talking about believers in the sense that they are fighting for religion. But obviously, for all of these, there is a strong historical connection between their culture, their identity, their language, and their religion. And religion is oftentimes the most obvious marker. The most obvious in this case because their language is very close to each other. So for long periods, Croat and Serbian was called Croato-Serbian or Serbo-Croatian, designing that this is effectively one language with two dialects. And Bosnian Muslims in between would in the 1980s at school, on Monday they would write in Latin, like the Catholics, like the Croats do. On Tuesday they would write in Cyrillic, like the Orthodox do. With other words, these religious markers do not relate to faith, but they relate to cultural identities that are being fed by historical narratives going back, for instance, to earlier wars and conflicts about territory. Within Yugoslavia, you had the idea that these religions and religious markers are still there, but socialism would make them obsolete. There would be a brotherhood of unity that is supplanting all the cultural and religious ideologies and identities. With other words, the idea of socialist Yugoslavia under Tito was that the new system of socialism would do away with the ethnic divisions and thereby also with ethnic hatreds, thereby also with the heritage of warfare between Croats and Serbs during the Second World War and going back into the 19th century and earlier. There would not be a utopia that everybody would be giving this up, but there was the idea that socialism would mitigate all these differences. At the same time, one major problem that led to the war is that within socialist Yugoslavia, you had a distinction between nations that were recognized by Yugoslavia as state nations, and these would be the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes, the Macedonians, and the Montenegrins. They would get their states, their republics. So every time I talk about a republic now, I mean a republic within Yugoslavia. One of these, Croatia, for instance, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, is a republic. They would get their own states, and that means they have a constitution, they have elections to a parliament, they have an own branch of the Communist Party, which is here called the League, and therefore they would also have a broad autonomy within Yugoslavia. But then you also had minorities that didn't have this. That would be, in the first place, Muslims. Muslims, until the 1970s, were part of Yugoslavia, of course, but they were living in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is not called Bosniak state. Well, Croatia is called after the Croatians, Serbia after the Serbs, but Bosnia-Herzegovina is a territory that is characterized by Croats, Muslims, and Serbs at the same time, plus other minorities. With other words, they obtained their status of being recognized as a state nation only in 1971. So they should be happy about that. But they didn't get their own republic because they were still living in this Bosnian-Herzegovinian patchwork. The two major minorities on the lowest level would be the Albanians of Kosovo, not of Albania because Albania was a separate state, and the Hungarians of the Vojvodina. Both Vojvodina and Kosovo were recognized as autonomous provinces, that is not of states, not as republics, but as provinces of Serbia, which means one major issue that we have to take into consideration from the very beginning is that Serbia had a microcosm of Kosovo in itself and of Vojvodina. And in Kosovo, the Albanians were a majority. They were not a minority. So this is a very difficult patchwork. You get 6 national republics, but these 2 autonomous provinces within Serbia, meaning that also the Serbs would have their own cause for concern, namely that they would lose Kosovo or Vojvodina, and the Kosovo Albanians and the Vojvodina Hungarians would have the major concern that they don't want to be assimilated by Serbia. This is the kind of springboard to the wars that I will be talking about after the break. Thank you very much. 15 minutes break. So what brought Yugoslavia to an end? If you look at this map, you see regional discrepancies. Slovenia and Croatia in the north are very close to Italy, Austria, and then Germany. Slovenia and Croatia have been the republics that produced most of the labor migrants to these countries, to the European Union, which means those countries also benefited from remittances, that is, workers here working at Ford in Köln or in Germany or in the Netherlands sent back money home. And families in Croatia and Slovenia would benefit from that money and build houses, buy cars, television sets, and so forth. Slovenia, and in particular Croatia, also blessed by being tourist destinations. So Dutch and German and other tourists would go with their campers to the long Croatian coast that you see here stretching down almost to Montenegro. That is also a major resource for Western money, for valuta, that the system of Yugoslavia needed. So these countries of the north were more developed, were wealthier than the south. At the same time, the more they became developed, the less their demographic curve was satisfactory, which means they lost people who went to the north as labor migrants, but also families were torn apart and the demographics go down. Actually, the communities are shrinking. In the southern republics of Yugoslavia, Macedonia, for instance, but also Kosovo, Montenegro, other parts of Serbia, and also Bosnia, the population would go up. Here you still have largely agricultural areas where people still have families. At the same time, these are also the territories that are underdeveloped. Underdeveloped meaning no industry. If industry is being put there, then it's industry that produces for the north, so that the surplus benefit, that is the surplus value of the production chain, is going to the north and is being then used for the car factories in Bosnia or in Croatia, but not in the south. With other words, within socialist Yugoslavia, you have discrepancies in wealth and in development, which means that socialist Yugoslavia under Tito tended to distribute wealth, which means the state was seen as an instrument for taking wealth from the north and investing it in the south so that you have more even development. This policy largely failed. Development policies failed and led to huge conflicts because the north said, why should we give up on the income that we generate? And the south said, the north has to give up so that we can reach the same level as the north, and then we will be able to produce to the same terms. And this conflict about money was played out within the Communist Party, within the, as they called it, the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, where each of these republics had their own branches. With other words, the major mechanism that you should keep in mind for Yugoslavia is not the one ruler that is keeping them all in check, but the ruler or the ruling office that is giving authority to the republics that then fight out their clashes amongst themselves. So the Croats against the Serbs against the Bosnians, and so forth. Which means you get a very complex economic picture that I just noted to you, where you get reformists, as we call them, in the north, that is people who want to have more liberal conditions for development, more business, more investment from the West, so that they produce for the Western markets, so washing machines and car parts, for instance, whereas the South, that is still bound by agriculture, wants to have a conservative and a central regime that redistributes the wealth of the North, redirecting it to the South. So the clash about the economic condition is being transformed into a political clash between liberals in the North and centralists and conservatives in the South. Now this all went well as long as Yugoslavia was still very much courted by the West and by the Soviet Union. They both had an interest in Yugoslavia as a kind of entity that could be either drawn to the Western side in the Cold War or to the Soviet side in the Cold War. So for a long period, Yugoslavia could maintain this development policy of redistributing wealth by its situation between the West and the East. However, with the end of the Cold War, and here I show you Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, that is the leader of the Soviet Union and the president of the United States, coming to terms about an end of the arms race and thereby an end of the Cold War. This meant that the global world had much less interest in Yugoslavia and was much more interested in getting loans back instead of giving loans to Yugoslavia. This means loans are now coming into Yugoslavia with the demand to reform the economy, to make it viable in an almost capitalist manner. And this leads to new frictions and new troubles between the republics. So, I mentioned a couple of points that we can mention as leading to the war. One is the kind of essentialist idea that there are ethnic hatreds, that people have been hating each other all the time, and that any peacetime is just an artificial stalemate. Now, this perception is very widespread, but it is wrong, because you have huge areas, huge periods of peace, where the old ethnic difficulties of the past have been overcome. But in order to do that, you need money, or at least you need the idea of a justified system that distributes the money. Then the iron fist model of Tito. And I already mentioned Tito didn't rule himself, but he ruled through the republics, which means he gave authority to the republics, who then fought out all these interests about economy and policies. The manipulation of the system by one man, and that's another interesting theory about how the wars came about, namely that Slobodan Milosevic, who becomes the leader of Serbia in various incarnations, is the main culprit for the war. In a way, this is true, because he was very much interested in carrying out a greater Serbia agenda, but at the same time, he was also driven by the events on the ground, which means by situations that he encountered and that he reacted upon. Other factors that are being mentioned as leading to the war is the illegitimate situation of the government itself and of the Communist Party. The Communist Party came to power after the end of the Second World War and was simply there and annihilated all opposition parties. With other words, it's a one-party state where you do not have a legitimate opposition. In a system that works like this, and where all conflicts are taking place within the Communist Party, there is no diversity, and there is a strong tendency towards uniting in camps, namely in nationalist camps. So under the umbrella of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, you had these factions that were in fact defending national interests, or at least were claiming to defend national interests. So, and then there are external influences like the end of the Cold War that made the situation of Yugoslavia more difficult. I don't want to bore you with this. What you get is if there are no loans coming in from the outside, and if the system is mismanaged because of the conflicts between republics and the kind of obliteration of the federal system, then you need loans from the outside because you have huge inflation. But this inflation actually augments to the dissatisfaction of the players, of the political players, but also of the population, and to the need for reforms. So this is the kind of chaos scenario from which the wars start. And now we have to briefly reflect on the end of the Cold War and the effect it had on Yugoslavia. The end of the Cold War means that two big federations are suddenly not there anymore. One is the Soviet Union and one is Yugoslavia. The third one would be Czechoslovakia, that also dissolved in 1993. But for Yugoslavia and for the Soviet Union, the model that we have to keep in mind is that we are talking about socialist bigger units that in one way or another call themselves federations, and that are being made up of entities. And that could be Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Russia in the Soviet Union, or it could be Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, and so forth in Yugoslavia. What happens then in 1991 with the Soviet Union is that this outer border, namely the Soviet border, is being gone, but the design of the republics within the Soviet Union is still there. The same for Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia collapsed as a federation, the question comes up, will we honor the boundaries of the elements that once made up Yugoslavia, or will there be conflicts because of the idea that there is no overlap of where the ethnic group lives and the territory that is assigned to that ethnic group? Now, the Yugoslav wars, or the wars fought about the succession of Yugoslavia, are many. The ones that I will mention is the war that started in Croatia by Serbs, that is Serbian minority in Croatia. Then comes another one that is in Slovenia, that I will not touch because it was so brief. It was an attempt to keep Slovenia in Yugoslavia. And then this long and protracted war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this war itself is a war that was fought between Serbs and Muslims, Croats against Muslims, and Croats and Muslims against Serbs. So there are different periods of this war, which means the major entities were fighting against each other. And only in the later year, the Croats and the Muslims joined forces to come to an end of Serb dominance and thereby creating the Bosnia-Herzegovina that we still have today. Tomorrow I will talk about Serbia's war in Kosovo. So what we keep in mind is a very difficult situation where wars emerge among the republics, but also within republics, in particular in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. What you see here on the map in red is territories that were at one point separating from Croatia by Serb forces that declared these territories to be independent, separate states. So within Croatia, you had a population of, 10–15% maybe, of Serbs living on the territory of Croatia, being citizens of Yugoslavia by virtue of being citizens of Croatia. Within Yugoslavia, this was no issue, because within Yugoslavia, the Serbs would be dominating anyways, also if they were living in Croatia. But as Yugoslavia decomposed, the Serbs living in Croatia were the first to set up barricades and to establish their territories that would be defended against Croat police and army forces. And this is what you get here, the Republic of Krajina, of the Serbian Krajina, which is one of these instances where the principle of trying to make the territory coincide with the territory of the state coincide with the territory of the national group leads to war, because it leads to war. It's the start of these wars in Yugoslavia. There is still, at that time, and when this happens, there is still a government of the whole of Yugoslavia, but it's paralyzed. The big players are Serbia, Croatia, and then these upcoming separatist groups in the Krajina. And you see that the Krajina is covering huge parts of Croatia, so it's a real problem to the sovereignty of Croatia. At the same time, it's divided. So one faction is not linked to the other part of it. In the year of 1990, in all of these countries, you have elections. And these are for the first time elections not monopolized by the Communist Party, but dominated by nationalist parties that most of them came out of the Communist Party. So the branches of the Communist Party in each of these countries that had been very nationalist anyways now form their own nationalist parties, sometimes with a socialist agenda, sometimes with a Christian democratic agenda, in the terms of the Muslims with a Muslim agenda. And they would be having the first elections in that year. And these elections, of course, are national elections of the Republic and not of the Federation. The multi-party system exists on the Republican levels, which means democracy is not associated with Yugoslavia as a whole, but is associated with Croatia, with Bosnia-Herzegovina, with Slovenia, and with Serbia. People would make their alliances with their own republic and no longer with the Federation of Yugoslavia as a whole. No? The problem then is what happens to these multi-ethnic areas, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, but also the Krajina area in Croatia, where the Serbs are setting up their own separatist entity. Not acknowledged by anybody in the world, but de facto they are there. Now I'm turning the focus onto Slobodan Milosevic, who is at that time the leader of Serbia. Serbia still claiming to be in union with Montenegro and upholding the idea of Yugoslavia. So Milosevic's idea was, let's not have independent states, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, but instead try to keep these areas together in Yugoslavia, which would continue to be dominated by the Serbs, because they are the biggest nation, they have most access to the police and to the national army, and they can keep the other republics under their control. And for Slobodan Milosevic, the idea was to keep Yugoslavia as a greater Serbia, and thereby use the Krajina Serbs, but also the Serbs in Kosovo, for instance, as his elements for keeping Croatia under control and keeping Bosnia-Herzegovina under control and keeping Kosovo under Serbian control. The instrument now, at that time, is the national army. The Yugoslav national army has been largely dominated by officers of Serbian background and Montenegrin background. With other words, the fact that Yugoslavia's army was dominated by Serbs means that at the beginning of these wars, the Serbs gain dominance over the violence, over the means of violence, over weapons and over ammunition and over the army personnel. And they use that in the Krajina to establish this Krajina Republic as a breakaway area from Croatia, but they use it then also in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Ethnic cleansing, here in yellow, is a term that is probably the most mentioned term when it comes to the Yugoslav wars. Ethnic cleansing, I put it here in quotation marks, is a propaganda term, and it's very difficult. Ethnic cleansing has still the connotation that we are cleaning something, that it's a process of purification, of wiping out dirt. So the word is very much fraught with conflict. In principle, we're talking about genocide, or attempts at genocide. And genocide as the definition to erase the presence of one group, ethnic, religious, linguistic, whatsoever, from a certain territory by violent means. And this is ethnic cleansing. But ethnic cleansing sounds like this is a process of purifying something, whereas genocide is clearly connected to the idea that this is a crime against humanity. So ethnic cleansing can come in various forms. It can come in the form of expulsion. You simply do not let people in, or you expel them from a territory. It can lead to direct killings by throwing grenades into houses and making sure that people do not come out, by arson, by putting a fire to houses. But it can also come in the form of eliminating architectural monuments, destroying mosques, destroying Catholic churches, destroying graveyards, cemeteries, because they are markers of a minority, for instance, of a Croat minority in Serbia or of a Muslim minority in Serbia. So ethnic cleansing is just one part of a bigger process of using violence for annihilating the other group that you define to be distinct from your own group, with a process in mind that your own group can only flourish if you kill off or expel or assimilate the other. This started actually in the Krajina and then came over to Bosnia-Herzegovina. This is a map of Bosnia-Herzegovina 2013 in terms of majorities again. I'm now zooming in to this green part here, Bosnia-Herzegovina, no longer within Yugoslavia, but within this process of dissolution where Milosevic, as the leader of Serbia, is still trying to maintain Yugoslavian hold on Croatia and on Bosnia-Herzegovina, and using the Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia-Herzegovina as his instruments. What you see here is the ethnic division in districts and in municipalities, and how much the Muslims, the green ones, are spread all over the place. For the blue territory, you have adjacent areas to Serbia, of course, and there you have adjacent areas to the Krajina region, which is the Serb region in Croatia, which means that the blue areas, the Orthodox Serb positions, benefit from their proximity to Serbia, from which they get ammunition and soldiers, and of course diplomatic and military support. Whereas the Muslims in the middle have nothing. There is no adjacent Muslim country that would support them. And the Croats are in the vicinity of Croatia, which, as you see on that map here, the pink part would go until this, and thereby the Croatian parts and the Croatian territories in Bosnia-Herzegovina at the start of the war would have close relations to the Republic of Croatia and get their support from there. Which means the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina starts from very uneven positions, and the Muslims are caught in between. Just in brackets, what does this mean for the European political thinkers, the observers? Do we want to split up Bosnia-Herzegovina into two parts and give one to Serbia and one to Croatia? Or do we want to maintain Bosnia-Herzegovina in order not to erase the presence of Muslims there? And what do we get if we cut up Bosnia-Herzegovina into two pieces? Is that not another war between Croatia and Serbia? By 1992, these countries had referenda, and the referendum in Bosnia-Herzegovina was clearly showing that there's a majority of those who participated in the referendum for an independent state. This referendum was staunchly rejected by the Serbian part, by the blue parts of the map of Bosnia-Herzegovina, because they said Bosnia-Herzegovina cannot be an independent state. Then we are in Serbia, we are in Bosnia-Herzegovina, cut off from Serbia, but also from the Krajina Republic that made itself independent in Croatia. You remember Bosnia-Herzegovina now being sandwiched between Serbia and between the Krajina Republic. So the Serbs resented the referendum, boycotted it, and started war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. This is the war at the peak of Serb expansion. What you see now in blue is, on the one hand, Sarajevo is being sieged. Sarajevo has a very long siege of, if I'm not mistaken, 1,100 days, besieged by Serbian forces and shelled by Serbian forces from the mountains around it. A very tragic story, much longer than the Leningrad siege by the Nazi Germans. But you also see that the Serbs have their bridgehead towards the eastern territories, have most of Bosnia-Herzegovina under their control, and have the connection to the Krajina Republic, which is the blue parts in Croatia. So this is 1995. It seems like the Serbs have won. The Serbs have won, the argument goes, also because the Europeans at that time had nothing really to decide on that matter. What the international community did very early on is an arms embargo. But this came through the United Nations already in 1991. The war starts, and then the first reaction by the world community is, we don't want to feed this war, so we cut former Yugoslavia off from weapons deliveries from other states. This would mean that the forces that are fighting out this war would get no supplies from the outside. Clear, right? Makes sense. You want to dry out a war by not allowing other states to provide weapons and thereby to prolong the war. Now, the basic error of this thinking is that you have not one army fighting against another army, but you have one army, namely the Yugoslav army, that is in the hands of the Serbs. Whereas the Croats and the Muslims had no armies, had no tanks, had no weapons, or at least had very little of this in order to defend themselves against the Serbs. Which, in other words, the arms embargo just cements the superiority of the Serbs. At the same time, we also, the United Nations, created safe zones. Safe zones, especially in eastern Bosnia, on territory held by the Serbs, would be the areas where Muslims would be going to in order to protect themselves from Serb violence. This is how the Dutch, but also others, French and so forth, African countries, stepped in and became, Pakistan was very much present, stepped in to protect Muslims in compounds, in areas that would be taboo for the Serbs, because there were white helmets, there were UN forces there to protect them. And Dutch people in the room, of course, know how difficult that was, and that it ultimately went wrong with Srebrenica. I'm now going forward to the end of this war, and then I'll be talking about that tomorrow. In the end, the war was decided not by forces on the ground, but largely by the Americans, who intervened after the Srebrenica massacre, after the genocide committed against the Bosnian Muslims in those protection areas. This then led to an agreement that brought together first the Muslims and the Croats, and then later on came to an agreement that we know as the Dayton Accords. But until that time, this war carried on, and it was very much unfortunate that the Europeans had almost nothing to say about that. What did the European community, we're talking about the area before Maastricht, have as options? Do we recognize the sovereignty of the existing states? So in my diagram here, do we naturally recognize the sovereignty of Croatia and of Slovenia and of Bosnia-Herzegovina, of Serbia and Montenegro and Macedonia? Or do we want to keep it all together with the idea that if we start changing the landscape of the political landscape of Yugoslavia, we are getting immersed into conflicts and will also have to face more war? What is the option? How do we get less war? By recognizing the parts that were the republics of Yugoslavia now as independent states. And then what do we do with those, for instance, Serbs that live in Croatia, like in the Krajina, or what do we do with the Kosovo Albanians that live in Serbia? What is the right to self-determination worth for these people? The article that I gave you by Kaplan is talking about this and is giving you the context also. The context of 1991 is, of course, the peaceful unification of Europe. The idea that the old regimes are gone, the Soviet Union relinquishes Central and Eastern Europe, Poland moves to the west, Czechoslovakia moves to the west, the GDR is being reunified with the Federal Republic of Germany. We have been memorizing these events, the fall of the wall, as great successes for peace and stability, for democracy, but also for liberal trade in Europe, for capitalism, which is a success story. At the same time, for Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia seems to be the kind of exception to this success story, because the same processes are at work and they lead to war. People go and vote in multi-party elections and they go to referendum, but it leads to wars. What does the European community at that time do? Germany is running ahead in the process for recognizing these states. How do we understand that? Germany now says Croatia and Slovenia, which are the ones, let this be Slovenia, the ones that are closest to Italy, to Austria, and thereby also to Germany. These are the areas that have the strongest history of statehood, and they have a strong presence in our country, so we are also dealing with Croatia because we have lots of Croatian labor forces in Germany and in Austria. Yeah? So for these, it is the easiest solution to simply say Slovenia is no longer part of Yugoslavia. Let the Serbs, let Milosevic say that he wants to keep Slovenia in Yugoslavia, but Slovenia is de facto already left Yugoslavia. Then what to do with Croatia? Croatia is also very homogeneous, except for this Krajina area, where you have a huge Serbian minority that is actually in these areas a majority. And then the Germans would say, if the Croatians ask us, let us also give sovereignty, independence, recognize the independence of Croatia, the independence from Yugoslavia, and thereby also from Serbia. But other states in the European Union, European community at that time, France and Great Britain, would be much more hesitant. On the one hand, they want to bind in Germany. Germany's unification came with the consent of the British and the French and the US, the Russians, the Soviets at that time still. So Germany was still on bail. It was still being observed as a country that needs to be bound into the European architecture, eventually also leading to the euro introduction, and that should not run ahead in such decisions. So in Paris and in London, people were much more hesitant and also much more understanding of the position of the Serbs, who suddenly lost so much. But also of the Serbs in Croatia, because after all, we're talking about a majority in the Krajina area that is Serb. So with other words, a recognition of any of these republics that emerge out of Yugoslavia, Yugoslav republics being turned into independent republics, the recognition by the world community and by the European community depends on how they treat their minorities. So that actually the autonomy for the Serbs in Croatia becomes a condition for the European community, for Brussels and the European leaders at that time, to recognize Croatia. And if Germany is running ahead with promising recognition in 1991 to Croatia, then it gives away the leverage that Europe has on Croatia to come to a deal with its minority, namely with the Serbs in the Krajina Republic. The article is a case study for understanding the difficulty of looking at the universal rights, the territory of states to have sovereignty and to defend their boundaries, including Croatia, but also including the Federation of Yugoslavia, which on paper still existed. With whom do you side? With Croatia within Yugoslavia, breaking out of Yugoslavia? Or do you believe the claims of Milosevic in Serbia, who says, this is still Yugoslavia, and recognize the sovereignty of Yugoslavia, please, and not the separate states of Croatia and Slovenia. And then there's the other universal right, and that's the right of self-determination. Now this right, that individual groups that feel suppressed, repressed by bigger nations, the right that they want their own autonomy or their independent state is very much debated and very depending on the circumstances, on the actual circumstances of each case. When do states become states after being parts of other states in the first place? The major examples of history are when empires fall apart. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls apart in 1918, and what we get is Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, nation states. That's clear. But in the case of Yugoslavia, as long as there is still a Serb rump Yugoslavia that maintains the claim that Yugoslavia is still alive, we now have the claim of Croatia to be sovereign, and the claim of the Serbs within Croatia to be sovereign as well, to be then reunited, hopefully, with Serbia. So two claims clash, and how does Europe navigate this complex situation? The idea is based on the argument that to recognize or not to recognize is a very important thing. Because according to international law, if you recognize another state, you recognize its legality. And that makes this entity an international player. This question of recognition is crucial for the wars. Because it means, is this a civil war within Yugoslavia, where entities of Yugoslavia are fighting against each other? Or do we recognize the independence of Croatia, for instance, or of Bosnia-Herzegovina? Then this is a war between international players, between international states. And then a whole different kind of setting, of legal setting also applies. Why does this question still matter? We are still in a situation where the European Union is expanding, and you have periods of European Union expanding fatigue, where not much happens, where we wait until negotiations continue. But on this map you see that today Ukraine is a candidate of the European Union, as well as many states of the Western Balkans. Yeah? And the yellow spot, Bosnia-Herzegovina, is still torn apart because no consensus can be reached as long as the Serbs stand against the Croats and the Muslims. Kosovo is another blank space here because it's not recognized by all states of the European Union and not by Serbia. I leave this out. So these declarations of independence by these two states start in June 1991. But already before that, you have this Krajina area, and I'm rushing through this here, that is under Serb dominance. For Bundeskanzler Kohl, who was the German chancellor of the unification of Germany, this was a kind of side maneuver area. The most important thing was to maneuver the unification of Germany in reconciliation with France and promise a broader integration of Germany into a new European Union that would come in with Maastricht in the early 90s. And the idea that Germany unified in a peaceful manner also supported the idea that in other states that emerged out of socialist countries, the same processes would be at work, namely a peaceful resolution of all problems by the prospect of wealth, that would occur due to the unification with the rest of Europe. Europe was seen at that time as the motor, as the engine of bringing stability to the world, to the European world in the first place, simply by economic development. So Europe saw itself as the kind of center where all these independent states now of Yugoslavia would be looking to for getting funds, for getting investments, and for sending their resources to, but also their labor forces. Kaplan argues that the European community at that time developed a policy of conditioned recognition. That is, when the leaders came together, and at that point the European community was the leaders of the individual states coming together, what we today call the Council, not the Commission. The Council coming together would set the policies and negotiate that amongst themselves. And the conditioned recognition would mean we recognize Croatia if they find deals and negotiate with their minorities, including with the Serbian minority. Then how to combine the rights of new states with the rights of these majorities? The prospect of recognition, the rights of minorities. The prospect of recognition would induce the emerging states, so Croatia, to adopt policies that reassures the vulnerable minority groups, and thereby to do away with conflict. With other words, there's a capitalist kind of rationale behind that. If you integrate these countries into a global market, which means a European market, then you create the conditions for wealth, and everybody will participate in that. And the legal condition for doing that is that you create autonomies all over Yugoslavia where there are minorities that on certain spots form majorities. If we do that, we can keep the system as it is, namely those 6 republics, and plus the autonomies that we have. Then, of course, it is the task of the individual republic to negotiate peaceful means with these minorities. Now, the instruments that the Europeans used in order to come to this kind of agreement were 2 elements. One is the Conference on Yugoslavia. The slides will be online after this class. The Conference on Yugoslavia would be a stage for Yugoslavian Republican leaders to negotiate with Europe. So they would come and we would have common meetings with the idea that the European community at that time, the European leaders, Kohl, Mitterrand, would be able to negotiate with them a peaceful end of Yugoslavia. A peaceful end, and then also the recognition of the boundaries would follow as the kind of compensation, as the kind of reward for cooperating with each other, but also with the European community. The second important instrument that the Europeans set up is this Volontaire Arbitration Commission. So this would be a commission of legal experts that would give recommendations, and that is in reality a kind of advice on how to understand what's happening in Yugoslavia. This advice came in the form of statements about Yugoslavia's state of affairs. So the one important statement is Yugoslavia is falling apart. This statement already presupposes that Serbia's claim on Yugoslavia as a whole is not valid anymore because Yugoslavia is in dissolution. That's probably the reality on the ground, but it has legal consequences because it means that we now have to focus on the individual republics and actually recognize them by talking to them, but also by forcing them to do what is number one, namely to protect their minorities. This is, on the one hand, a statement for autonomies within the national states, within these new independent states, but it's also a statement that the boundaries between, say, Croatia and Bosnia, or Bosnia and Serbia, all the boundaries of Bosnia should not be changed. So this is cementing the idea that Yugoslavia fell apart, but the constituent elements of Yugoslavia, namely the republics, must be recognized as they were and not differed. And this is not changed. And this is this legal statement, uti possidetis juris, as you have rights already. So the elements coming out of this Federation of Yugoslavia are being treated on the grounds of the rights of territory and boundaries and institutions that they had when they were still part of Yugoslavia. So the agreement is that Yugoslavia's constituent elements should be recognized. The same applies for the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union falls apart, this is a map of the Soviet Union, all the republics, 15 republics of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, the Baltic states, become recognized as independent states in the boundaries that they had within the Soviet Union. There is no war between Kazakhstan and Russia at that time over territory. There are millions of Russians living in Kazakhstan, but Russia refrains from claiming Kazakhstani territory or from claiming Ukrainian territory at that point. Because any claim on the territory of another state would lead to conflict and to war. At that time, for the Soviet Union, it largely worked out. There were lots of conflicts, but they were not between the big states. Whereas in Yugoslavia, it failed miserably. See you back tomorrow. Thank you.